Our moral character matters. At the end of the day, the number of your books that you've written doesn't matter. And how great your podcast isn't of most importance, nor is how much money you have or how big your church is. None of that really matters in the grand scheme of things. We should really make the time in our lives to invest into our character.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, where we help you experience and bring renewal to your mission field. Join us and receive free resources at innovativechurchleaders.org. Well, on today's episode of the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, I'm excited to have with me Andy Steiger. How you doing, Andy?
It is great to be with you, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Well, I found you through Apologetics Canada. You guys do such great work up there. You've got several books that we'll be giving away to those of you who receive my email newsletter. You can sign up at ericbryant.org. But Andy, I want to talk for a little bit about what motivated you towards apologetics and even the origins of Apologetics Canada.
Yeah, thanks. And for any of your listeners who are like, what on earth is apologetics? It just comes from a Greek word, apologia. And in fact, it's used in Greece today. They still use the same word. And it's found in our Bibles. It means to give an answer or a reason. Often it has the context of like a court of law. But in the Bible, we see it being used, like, for example, in 1 Peter 3:15, to give an answer or reason for the hope that you have in Jesus. So as an organization, we are an evangelistic organization that seeks to give people good reasons to place their hope in Jesus. And then Peter goes on to say, and to do that in gentleness and respect, which is interesting given the context that Peter was writing in. He was writing in a time of persecution to churches that were experiencing persecution, which is interesting. Like Cappadocia was one of the churches he was writing to that he mentions. And I was just recently there. So it was pretty cool, to appreciate the context that he's writing into. And I think that a lot of us feel currently, whether you're in the United States or Canada or globally, there's a lot of persecution. And what does it look like to give good reasons for the hope that you have? I pastored for 20 years, Eric, and I really never saw myself being an apologist. I always saw myself being a missionary. But ultimately, I wanted to see people come to know and love Jesus. I saw how effective apologetics is in the tool belt of discipleship. And one thing led to another, and God led me to founding this organization back in 2010.
Well, it's an amazing organization, apologeticscanada.com. You have a podcast. You have several folks that are part of your organization. I've had a chance to interview Stephen Kim and Raphael Samuel. Wes Huff is one of the folks that works with you, and he's all over the place since he landed on Joe Rogan. It's funny because years ago, I wrote a book in which I mentioned that love is the new apologetic. And a lot of that I still believe. How we treat others explains to folks that the gospel is real. It's related to John 17 when Jesus prayed for those who would believe that we would be unified, that we would be loving towards each other and certainly towards the world we're trying to reach. But I have to tell you, Canada is a little bit further along in the post-Christian slide, although there's signs, really beautiful signs of what God's doing there and in the UK. I would love to hear sort of this approach that you have, because you guys aren't shy about kind of going toe-to-toe with skeptics who are confronting the message of Jesus. And you come certainly with love, but also with grace, but also with a lot of truth. Talk about how Apologetics Canada has made a difference in Canada these last 15 years.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, I feel like Canada and the United States compete to see who can be more secular these days. So it seems like it depends upon which week. But you're right. We tend to be pretty far down the path, especially in certain areas. For us, when we, as we have grown and with our staff, we, as an organization, we've often thought, okay, what's kind of like the catch line, if you will, that we can, or the elevator pitch that we can tell people this is Apologetics Canada. And one of the things that we early on latched onto is just simple words by Jesus. He talks about what's the greatest commandment. And this comes up regularly in the New Testament, in which he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. And we reduce that down to love God, love people. So as an organization, that's the ethos of what we do. we love God and we love people. And so in doing, apologetics or evangelism, we do it from that perspective of the greatest commandment. What does it really look like to care for people? And notice even that greatest commandment, right? It's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. Is to love God with everything that it means to be human, and to do that with excellence. And sometimes we tend to leave the mind at the door. So as an organization, we really focus in on how do we love God with our minds? How do we seek after truth, but to do that in a gracious manner that's more holistic. So we actually do things too where, we often will platform great organizations that are serving around the world. We really try our best to embody what Jesus called all of us to. And one of the things that you're right, Eric, we often do find ourselves in the hot seat with skeptics of all sorts. In fact, I run something regularly called Questioning Christianity out of my own church, and we see people come to faith on the regular. But one of the things that I find just so important is when I'm coming into those situations and I'm talking with people about Jesus, I am not doing so to try to win an argument. I'm not doing so because I think I have all the answers and I'm some sort of Bible answer man. I'm not doing that because I think people are a project. I'm doing it because I genuinely love God and I want to let people know about Jesus, and I'm just going to be faithful with the opportunities that Jesus gives me. It's that simple.
Well, I love that. And I feel like in many ways, your book Reclaimed is a good example of that. You're trying to help people see how Jesus restores our humanity in a dehumanized world. Talk about the message of that book and why it's so important for believers, church leaders, pastors to communicate who God is for, not just what we're against, so to speak.
Yeah, that's an important. In a culture like ours, as you know, Eric, we live in a very combative culture where people these days, you try to get the most likes, if you will, by or views, watching somebody get dunked on and the like. We're not interested in that. We're not trying to do that, of course. But when I wrote the book Reclaimed, one of the things that I wanted to do was really just help people to see the beauty of the gospel and how we can clearly communicate the beauty of the gospel in a way that humanizes, that is an apologetic to the dehumanization in our world that comes at us in a variety of different ways. So my background, by the way, is I did a PhD in the area of philosophy, but it was in theological anthropology, what it means to be human. And a large part of my doctoral work was in the area of artificial intelligence. And I just see so much of whether it be the technology or in the ideologies that we embrace and often influence the way we use technology, can be very, very dehumanizing. And there's a lot of people out there that are lost and that are in need of guidance, of help. So, for example, we have technologies today that can, outsource your need for relationship, or at least try to. And not surprisingly, we live in a really lonely world, a world where maybe a lot of people spend majority of their time online, or it can be, worse than that. They're spending their time with chatbots and the like. Like that's a real thing that's going on. And I think as the church, we have this opportunity to humanize, right? To be a place, a beacon of hope and community, of relationship, where we can think together, where we can serve together, where we can worship together. That's an important holistic way of looking at what it means actually to be the church. I could say a whole lot more, as you could imagine, but I think these days we have to think more and more in those terms. And interestingly enough, maybe you can appreciate this as well. I think some people, they've heard or seen how combative our culture can be, and they just anticipate that everybody's combative and mean and angry. And I don't find that to be the case at all. I do find there's a lot of hurting and lonely people out there. But when you encounter them face to face, it's a very different interaction than pixel to pixel.
So true. And, watching your YouTube channel, watching you and the other members of your team have these hard conversations, and yet with such grace and kindness, and like you said, humanizing others and not so combative, is really wonderful and something to learn from. I love your heart for even righteousness as an apologetics,
Mm-hmm.
a way to demonstrate how real God is. Talk about the importance of that for pastors and church leaders of making becoming like Jesus a priority.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is something that we need to give a lot more thought to. I'm giving it a lot more thought. And it's actually guiding me more and more in the way that I mentor young people. I spend quite a bit of time mentoring, and I've done so in not only practical ways as young people learn to become pastors, but also academically doing academic mentorships and the like. And I remember one mentorship that I just had recently with a intern named Daniel. And at the end of this internship, they sat us down and said, Andy, do you have any final wisdom that you want to pass on to Daniel? And this is something that God had been stirring in my heart even through that internship. I don't want to pretend like I came into pastoral ministry having all the answers. But this is one of those things that God really has impressed over the years of ministry. And I was sharing it with Daniel, and it comes from Matthew 5. I think it's important to appreciate in Matthew chapter 5, this is often called the Sermon on the Mount, but I would call it the identity sermon. Jesus is preaching about what does a godly identity look like. And he begins with these Beatitudes, which is Latin for blessings, is talking about what leads to a blessed or flourishing life. And he says in verse 6, hunger and thirst after righteousness, and you'll be filled. I was just thinking and praying about this, and maybe you can relate to this, Eric, but there's a lot of young people that hunger and thirst after lots of things, and righteousness isn't on the list. We're hungering and thirsting after likes, followers, subscribers. We're, especially these young pastors, and Daniel's one of these, hungering after things like book deals, podcasts, preaching to big crowds, that that's just something I see amongst a lot of the young pastors that are up and coming. And I really think that we have this need to impress on them as Christians, and this needs to, of course, be true of ourselves. What should we truly be hungering and thirsting after, as Jesus said? Well, and it's righteousness, that our moral character matters. Now, let me ask you a question, Eric. I have books in my library, and I have this one right here. I kind of like that it's just kind of a bit of a bland cover that you can't fully see what you don't know what's all going on here. But this is a book that I have read a number of times, and I loved it. And I've preached out of this. I've quoted out of this. But a few years ago, I found out that the entire story was false.
Mm.
There was nothing true in this.
Mm.
And what do we do with a book like that? Like, we toss it. I've kept it around just to remind me
Yeah.
of the importance of truth, but not just truth in the stories that we tell, but in the truth of the stories that we live. I mean, do you got any books in your bookshelf that you're not sure what to do with now? Maybe it's
Sure.
because of the content or the content of the character of the person who wrote it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. The people who fall, and it's like all of a sudden you think, man, what was actually true in there? And it is very disconcerting. And we aren't representing Jesus well when we attain a certain level of notoriety or sell a certain number of books only to cheat on our wife or get kicked out of our church because of our rage issues. I think you're right on with this importance of building our character. Maybe let us in a little bit, kind of mentor us for a moment, as you did Daniel and many others. What are some of the steps you would encourage church leaders and pastors to take to move towards more and more righteous living?
Yeah, I think the first step that we really have to appreciate, and something that I have to remind myself constantly of, is that at the end of the day, the number of your books that you've written doesn't matter. And how great your podcast isn't of most importance, nor is how much money you have or how big your church is. None of that really matters in the grand scheme of things. I mean, if we were just to use history's whipping boy, Hitler, as an example, he had all those things. He's famous, wealthy, held a high position, wrote books and the like. But nobody cares about any of that stuff. And why is that? And the reality is because we know that your moral character is what really matters. At the highest level, your identity is understood by your moral character. And if that's true, and I believe that it is, and I think it's one of the things that Jesus is getting after, that your moral character matters, then we should really make the time in our lives to invest into our character. I mean, how much time do we invest into writing books and getting subscribers and the like? But do we have the same tenacity for our moral character? And please hear me here. I'm not trying to preach some sort of moralism, and nor was Jesus in Matthew 5,
That's
6.
right. Yeah.
This isn't a moralism. In fact, Jesus concludes all of the Beatitudes by saying, hey, and by the way, unless your righteousness far succeeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you have no hope of making it into heaven. And then, of course, everybody's like, well, then who can, right? And Jesus saying, well, what's impossible with you is possible with God. And that ultimately our righteousness at the highest level as Christians is founded in Jesus. There's no doubt about that. But that's always meant to encourage and inspire you to be more and more like Jesus. I love how Jesus puts us in John chapter 13, 34 to 35. He says, a new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. Now, just think about that for a moment. I think when Jesus is saying this is a new commandment I'm giving you, I can't help but think he's playing off of the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus is saying, sometimes we don't love our neighbor as we ought to, of course. And he's saying, and if you want to know what it really means to love your neighbor, Jesus is saying, I'm actually the standard of what that looks like. Love one another as I have loved you. And then he goes on to say, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, right? They'll know you're a student of mine if you love one another. Right. And again, he's speaking to that idea of moral character, not because this is a message of moralism, but it's a message of response to the love that you've received that you want to emulate, that you want to grow in. So that idea of character is something I think at churches we need to spend more time honing into those that we're discipling. And I don't know about you, Eric, but I mean, man, when you're in school, when you're in seminary, and often when you're in church, it's just not a message that I ever was taught.
Yeah. Too often it's assumed that you're going to spend time with God and learn to hear his voice and understand what it's like to rest in him. And out of the overflow of that relationship, you serve and you grow and you become more like Jesus. But I love your intentionality. You can't just drift into righteousness. There's a level of dependence on Jesus. Some friends of mine have started a new ministry for pastors in Arkansas, Mike and Lori McDaniel, and they talk about, the Great Commission and the Great Commandment are important and we need to keep them at the forefront. But don't forget about the Great Invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary. This idea of ministry should be alongside of Jesus as he carries that yoke, with us. I'd love for you to just share a little bit more. In addition to, pursuing righteousness, what are some of the questions that you think pastors and church leaders need to wrestle with in order to answer a skeptical world? Maybe some of the folks you're seeing respond to faith in Canada, maybe there's some topics in there that you guys see just keep coming up that you could help us with.
Yeah, that's a great question, and kind of ties into this in a couple levels. One of the biggest questions that we hear these days may surprise listeners. I don't encounter a lot of atheists anymore these days. It's kind of hard to be a social justice warrior if you think life is without meaning, purpose, or value. That it just doesn't seem to work. So we live in a culture today that more or less has this ethic to it, although it's an ethic that's often pointed at other people and never pointed back at itself,
Yeah.
right? And so one of the questions, though, that comes out of that isn't necessarily whether or not God exists, but is a question of, well, is God good? But isn't it interesting that in this current moment, it's about God's character that we're the most concerned with, not our own character, and asking, am I good? And one of the things that I see happening quite a bit, and it ties in with this, I think is an interesting question for us just even to consider. And that is, how do we deal with somebody like King David? If we're going to talk about books that we're not sure if we should read anymore because of people and their moral character, what about David? Do we throw out the Psalms? Because David got a lot of things right, sure, but he got a lot of things wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know about you. I got 2 kids, Eric, and I remember at my church, and this is no indictment against my church on this, but they had this Bible that they gave our kids that they came home with called the Superheroes Bible. And it would have like these, it'd have like Moses and David in these superhero poses, as though they're the superheroes in the story. But we got to be careful, don't we? They're not the superhero in the story. They're actually flawed, broken people. And they're pointing us to this need for one who's not flawed or broken. And I want to hear your thoughts on this, but my thinking is I can't help but think that the reason why David was called a man after God's own heart and is somebody that is still worth reading is because David could see his brokenness and was willing to repent and return back to the Lord.
Yeah, I think you're right. I am a part of a church that has said for years, no perfect people allowed. And in
I like
essence, it's a declaration that I am broken and I need help. Because if you don't acknowledge your brokenness and that you need help, you're in no position to actually make progress. And so, Andy, I really appreciate the conversation. I want to point people also to your website, andysteiger.com/books. You'll see there books on everyday apologetics, a book called Thinking, Answering Life's 5 Biggest Questions. Of course, we talked about Reclaimed earlier, but you also have children's books. Maybe real quick, share with us a little bit about the children's books you've written.
Yeah, thanks. So this was a part of the Human Project that we were working on. So really helping children wrestle with those profound questions of who and what we are as human beings and what leads to our flourishing. And so there's 3 books in that series. I think that they're excellent. They're worth checking out and reading to your kids for sure.
Thank you so much for the time, Andy. Keep up your great work. God bless.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It was great being with you.
Thanks for listening to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and share as we bring spirit-led innovation, reach new people, and make disciples who make disciples. Be sure to sign up for our email newsletter at innovativechurchleaders.org for free resources and an opportunity to join a cohort with Dr. N.T. Wright.